Good afternoon, everyone. For this final session, I'm Andrew Singleton of Deakin University. I'm chairing this session. Now, just before we begin, and especially to any international guests who are watching, and kudos to you if you're watching live, because it's an achievement to be up in the middle of the night. Otherwise, you're catching up with this later on video. What we customarily do is acknowledge Indigenous ownership at the start of a session or presentation. So I'll offer that acknowledgement now. So no matter where we're sitting or standing right now, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of that land. My university campus sits on the land of the Wadwarung people of the Kulin Nation, and my house, where I'm standing now, is on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. They're always here and they'll always will be here. So we've got three papers in this session: Conspirituality, QAnon, and the far right. And that picks up some of the threads and themes that we had in our previous session, which also explored QAnon, conspirituality, and the far right. So we had a great discussion and some really interesting papers, and I look forward to that. Our first paper comes from Lydia, Khalil, and Vivian Gerrand, both of the Alfred Deakin Institute. Lydia is also a research fellow in the West Asia program at the Lowy Institute and manages the Lowy Institute's core partnerships with a global network of extremism and technology. Dr. Vivian Gerrand is a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, and she is the author of Possible Spaces of Somali Belonging, which was published by Melbourne University Press. And I welcome both of them for their presentation. And just I should add, if you've got questions as we go along, just please pop them into the questions box and we'll address them all at the end of the panel, and I'll direct them to particular panelists. Thank you to Lydia and Vivian. It's over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Hope everyone can hear us okay. Yep, well, thank you again. Thank you everyone for including us in this event. It's an honor to be with you all. Today, we've learned a lot so much already from all of the other presenters, and we look forward to the presenters to come. Our presentation today is on how QAnon, wellness, and the far-right communities intersect. Both Vivian and I are coming at this topic with backgrounds in the study of violent extremism and radicalization, and also through our backgrounds in the application of countering violent extremism programming. So in our exploration of QAnon and wellness and spirituality, we're drawing from our research as well as the substantial literature already out there on radicalization to violence. And in our presentation today, we want to highlight a couple of things. Firstly, to define QAnon, to better explain how it intersects with the far right, and explaining some of the connections between QAnon, far right, and militant wellness. And also present some preliminary case studies of two individuals in the Australian context who have come from wellness communities and who have drifted more explicitly into the extreme right and the far right. And this drift from wellness to more explicit identification with the far right and extreme right we observe is through the QAnon/conspiracy pipeline, and has been occurring through the context of the global pandemic, the ensuing lockdowns, and the response to restrictions, which have been particularly strict in Australia. But we just want to emphasize that these are preliminary observations in our studies. And so we look forward to kind of testing them out here and presenting them through the discussion and through the Q&A. So if we could go on to the next slide. And what is QAnon? That's the first question I think that we need to answer. And I think many of the presenters today have provided a really illuminating glimpse into the movement. Is it a political movement? Is it a cult? Is it religion? And part of the reason why it's been understood and interpreted so broadly is because it is a very broad movement. It's a fluid movement. Sometimes it's an incoherent movement that encompasses a variety of different beliefs. So therefore, it's been a bit difficult to describe and to conceptualize. It has been flexible and accommodating to a variety of conspiracies and brings in disparate communities of believers and conspiracy ideas. It's also part of our broader disinformation ecosystem and part of the infodemic that we're experiencing right now, which is the overabundance of information, both online and offline. And it includes, and it's part of the deliberate attempt to disseminate wrong information to undermine public health responses and advance alternative agendas. So it's been alternatively described as a lot of different things, as a conspiracy, as a big tent conspiracy, even an alternative religion, as a lot of QAnon now intersects with evangelical Christianity as well as alternative spirituality movement, something that's been referred to by previous speakers, both spiritual and religious movements that have a very strong individual focus. But in our conversation about the expansiveness of QAnon, we really should not lose fact of the site that at its core, it's two things. The first is that it's a far-right conspiracy that has a major global far-right politician and influencer in Donald Trump at its center. And it's a vehicle for far-right extremist narratives and ideologies, and it's seen as a solution to address those grievances. And it's also led to violence. It's not only was it prevalent in the recent Capitol siege, but according to a report on domestic radicalization from the Sturt consortium, as of March this year, there were 63 ideologically motivated attacks in the United States alone through QAnon. Not only is it a far-right extremist movement, but it's also an anti-Semitic conspiracy. If we can go on to the next slide, we'll see that essentially QAnon is a rebranding of an ancient anti-Semitic conspiracies that have been made modern via their intersection with internet culture and the social media logic, which was again something that presenters of our previous panel also talked about very eloquently. Former George Mason University professor of genocide studies, Gregory Stanton, has made this point as well, that it is a rebranding of old anti-Semitic theories in an article he wrote called QAnon, a Nazi cult rebranded. And he's been quoted to say that the world has seen QAnon before and it was called Nazism. And I think we can understand QAnon this way because the conspiracy that it's at the heart of QAnon, that there's a secret cabal that's taking over the world by kidnapping children and drinking their blood to gain power, and that this cabal is comprised of individuals in high positions of government, finance, media, mainstream religious movements. And furthermore, that this deep state cabal is financed by Jewish money. Now, those who first encounter that theory through QAnon, it sounds like a particularly fantastical modern type of anti-Semitic conspiracy. And it is that, but it's also a modern version of the old anti-Semitic blood libel conspiracies outlined in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The QAnon conspiracy is essentially the same blood libel conspiracy, which claimed that Jews kidnap and slaughter Christian children and then drain their blood, and that they are embedded in a powerful cabal that control global institutions. So essentially, QAnon is just a modern internet version of the same anti-Semitic codified conspiracies around ritual murder and harm of children that even predated the Protocols document and have existed since the 12th centuries. And QAnon is not only a repackaging of old anti-Jewish conspiracies, but it's also a repackaging of Nazi symbols, Nazi language, and themes. The QAnon slogan, "The Coming Storm," which refers to the day of mass arrests of this cabal, presumably led by Trump, echoes the Nazi Night of the Long Knives, which was the purge of the Nazi leaders by Hitler in 1934. And that's presumably what the QAnon supporters were hoping would happen in the Capitol insurrection. The language and the use of the word storm is also very similar. You have the Sturmabteilung, the storm detachment or the stormtroopers, or Der Stürmer, which was the weekly publication published in Nazi Germany. And that storm language is also repeated in QAnon as well. You have QAnon's paraphernalia that reads Camp Auschwitz, work brings freedom, which greets prisoners at the concentration camps, which is the same slogan that greeted prisoners at concentration camps. You also have another QAnon slogan, 6MWE, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough, also a reference to the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust. So clearly QAnon has a clear connection to Nazism, to anti-Semitism, and it is clearly a far-right political conspiracy with a global far-right leader at its center. So therefore, we really shouldn't be surprised that belief in QAnon conspiracies or elements therein number one, would appeal to individuals who are already anti-Semitic or have neo-Nazi or far-right beliefs, but two, could potentially lead people to anti-Semitic, authoritarian, fascist, extreme far-right narratives and beliefs. And this appears to be the case for a number in the wellness community who ascribe to a form of militant wellness and purity and who have drifted into the far right.
So as Lydia mentioned earlier, we're considering this phenomenon through the prism of scholars of violent extremism and radicalization to violence. And this is a sort of a concept map that is based on a body of literature that's concerned with why and how people radicalize to violence. And so when we think about trajectories of radicalization, as we need to in this contemporary case of people radicalizing to violence through conspiracy like QAnon, in militant wellness that's militant, it's useful to think in terms of conducive environments. So as many speakers have already described, we're in this new environment of uncertainty, in which there is a threat, an existential threat. And at the same time, there is a context of people with platforms who provide unique selling points. So pull factors, so people are being pushed by a conducive environment and they're being pulled in by a series of unique selling points. And we can see how influencers have profited within wellness circles from this context. And also we can see how vulnerabilities have come to pass, and very unique grievances and very valid grievances that people have actually been then sources of opportunity for people to recruit them into particular ideologies and conspiracy thinking, and then in a minority of cases into violent action. So that we're looking at a couple of case studies in this presentation, and everyone's, I'm sure, familiar with Pete Evans and his his deplatforming that happened after he posted a cartoon in the bottom left of this slide with the caterpillar wearing the Make America Great Again cap and the butterfly with the Sonnenrad black sun symbol that was mobilized by the Christchurch shooter before he killed 51 people in Christchurch in 2019. And so what's interesting about the trajectory of Pete Evans, and as much as a lot of people dismiss him as simply being unhinged, is that he's not a case in isolation at all. In fact, he's somewhat part of this trend that we call militant wellness that I first heard about on the Conspirituality podcast earlier in 2020. And I thought it was an incredibly apt way of describing this tendency. So what's interesting, I think, is seeing the way that militant wellness provides these unique selling points, or provides some kinds of answers that people can latch onto, can provide a sense of certainty, purity, belonging, of course, but an exclusivist kind of belonging, defined by colleagues as a kind of belonging that constructs an in-group and a necessary out-group. So it's not a belonging that comprises everyone, it's a belonging that only some can adhere to, or only those who are willing to awaken and reject masks and reject lockdowns and reject vaccines can awaken. As we've heard earlier, there is also magical thinking involved. So to address anxieties, magical thinking can step in to support that. There's a desire for simplicity that comes out of the incredible complexity of what we're facing, and invocations of a mythologized past, which we see in other extremist organizations, certainly not unique to wellness, but we see them far right, Islamists, all kinds of groups will use this idea of the glorified past that then becomes a justification for particular kinds of politics. We also see, again, a mobilization of essentialist understandings of gender. So in the face of increasingly fluid modes of identification, there is this desire to return to a certain kind of understanding of gender, which we see manifest through a range of different influences, and you'll see in these case studies. We also see a promise of being able to have sovereignty and control, awakening, but within a context of atomization, and also a sort of survival of the fittest narrative. So if you're sick, it's your own fault, similar to the neoliberal invocation, if you're poor, it's your own fault. So blaming the individual if their immune system, if they die from COVID, well, they were meant to die. We need to weed out the weak. Yeah, that's very much a thread running through this kind of ideology. And I've put together on this slide a couple of what I can see on Pete Evans' Telegram platform. Since he was deplatformed from Facebook and Instagram, he's gone onto Telegram, as have many others. And he's only on Instagram now through his Evolve network, which is basically pretty devoid of politics other than his recent post about joining the Great Australia Party, but he's not actually posting any kinds of symbols. He's mainly posting about health techniques like his new kind of cold therapy technique and comforting recipes that he can't now publish anywhere else. And I'm drawing on another very well-known influencer in this space who's also gone on this trajectory of militant wellness, who bought a gun around the time of the US election last year and proudly, was posting about his training towards arming himself and preparing for an incipient civil war, using terms like spiritual warfare, distinguishing between being woke and awake to position himself as definitely not on the left anymore. He was once seemingly on the left. And then also in his post, using his newborn son to, I guess, discredit ideas of gender fluidity and attack people in trans communities by, again, posting about these sort of jokes about no biological difference between men and women. And so he decided to start breastfeeding his son, Wilder. And I wanted to differentiate between militant wellness and wellness. We can see people within wellness communities who, are doing something much more complex, and they're still profiting in an atomized capitalist neoliberal wellness community, but they're not advocating for a kind of exclusivism. On the other hand, they're actually saying COVID exists. Gwyneth Paltrow is a COVID long hauler, and Gwyneth Paltrow is also posting articles on her Goop blog about how the Equality Act protects trans youth, and articles about chronic fatigue syndrome and COVID-19. So not denying the pandemic, still in the wellness space, but doing something quite different. I think it's really important to have that distinction in mind, so that all, as Anna was saying in an earlier session, all of the wellness communities are not tied with the same brush. We have to be able to distinguish, and what's interesting is what leads some and not others down this particular road. So we can see Pete Evans has now, he's on the trajectory of joining this Great Australia Party. He's in cahoots with Craig Kelly, recently left the Liberal Party to become an independent MP. Craig Kelly has been posting hoax and false information, disinformation on his social media accounts. I'm not sure if he's still doing it. I think he was shadow banned from doing it last year, but until very recently was doing that. So I guess Evans is seeing this as a political opportunity for himself to cozy up to Kelly and perhaps get some clout in the next Australian election. Over to you, Lydia.
Thanks, Vivian. In addition to people like Pete Evans, which Vivian talked about, who was someone who was also posting Nazi imagery, and something that which finally got him deplatformed from the mainstream social media platforms. We also see people like Eve Black, who's another case study that we're taking a look at. Someone that we've also identified who's emerged from the wellness community. She was a fitness instructor and who's drifted to the far right via her engagement with QAnon, and has now positioned herself also as a far right influencer. And she's someone who, in her rhetoric and actions, have displayed a lot of the concepts that Vivian was describing. She came to prominence originally by filming herself flouting through lockdown restrictions here in Victoria, talking her way out of an interstate border checkpoint. And she was one of the many anti-lockdown protesters that intersected with the sovereign citizen movement, who was also a member of the wellness community, who then also posted online about conspiracies and wellness. She was also involved in or taken in by the QAnon conspiracy, and you can see in her Facebook page and her LinkedIn page, which have since been taken down, that she had Q symbols to identify herself as a believer in the QAnon theory. She was later arrested for flouting the lockdown rules, and in doing so kind of became this poster girl of the anti-lockdown movement. She's currently fighting her legal battle, but while she's doing so, she's become more and more engaged with the Australian far-right community, not just the anti-lockdown groups. So since then, she's been posting on alternative social media channels where she has a number of far-right followers. She posts about health, wellness, religion. And in the process, she's become a promoter of these essentialist gender roles that Vivian referred to, discussing female submission in traditional marriage to men. She's used a lot of the language and the memes and the narratives that are very familiar to the far right, saying things like she's been wife-pilled. And she's also using her platform now to discuss her return to Orthodox Christianity as a return to purity and tradition. And she continues to promote conspiracy beliefs on her social media platforms as well. But she's also promoted violence in the name of purity. She's posted things like, we need war in nature to eliminate weaker populations, which you can see on the slides. And I think that that's indicative of the relationship that some of these figures have with violence and the promotion of violence. It's often deliberately ambiguous. So she'll post things like that, but then she was recently made an appearance on the XYZ platform, which is an Australian alt-right platform, where when she was asked about Premier Daniel Andrews and his unfortunate accident where he slipped down the stairs and severely injured his back, she would say things, well, probably someone gave him what he had coming, and that's just a cover story. And then she would immediately then laugh it off and say, oh, I'm turning my life to Jesus, don't make me say something aggressive. So it's an indication of this kind of ambiguous embrace of violence. It's very difficult to discern at this stage in the trajectory of some of these people who are moving from wellness through conspiracies to the alt-right. And so I think we've seen, though, with both individuals like Pete Evans and Eve Black and others, they both originally came from communities promoting wellness. They promoted QAnon and conspiratorial beliefs. They espouse this militant wellness and emphasis on purity. Both have embraced far-right tropes and narratives and ideologies and positions. Pete Evans himself also posted Q content and pro-Trump content. Both have also repeated anti-Semitic tropes and have used anti-Semitic imagery. And also that's, again, this kind of ambiguous relationship to violence and, say, revolutionary action.
So as we come to the end of our presentation, these are some of the key research questions that we have as we go more into this project of qualitative case studies. So we're keen to understand these processes of radicalization in more depth to QAnon and the far right, and we're interested in finding out how we might address the conducive environment of atomization in the pandemic. How do we address the loss of livelihood, the existential uncertainty, climate crisis in pro-social ways, as opposed to these exclusivist, antisocial and violent ways? And how has the reinforcement of profiting from extremist views deepened through increased time spent immersed in online environments? So how do we understand the algorithms? It seems like work is already being done in this space to try to change some of them and to also deplatform, but much more than deplatforming has to occur, obviously, because a lot of these narratives are also coming from the top down. And deplatforming doesn't really address conducive environment. It simply addresses messaging online. To what extent has the exposure to and take-up of social influence toward violent extremism occurred through conspiracy-based anti-Semitic propaganda? What alternatives can be mobilised to offer tangible supports beyond the promise of purity, simplicity, black and white retrotopia-based thinking and certainty? And to what extent, finally, are conspiracy theories a gateway to far-right violence? Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Oh, thank you both. Brilliant. You came in at exactly 20 minutes, which fantastic on top of what was a really interesting and compelling presentation, particularly with that local focus on Eve Black and also Pete Evans. So thank you for that. Next, we've got Dr. Kaz Ross. And Kaz is a China expert with a PhD in political science and a specialist research interest in far-right extremism and conspiracies. So I think that there'll be some excellent tie-in there. Kaz, if you've got some slides, please welcome to put them up. And people, if you've got any questions, just pop them into the Q&A and we'll be able to attend to them at the end of this session. So Kaz, your screen looks like it's up and ready to go. So please, when you're ready, that'd be great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I just start off by saying that I'm actually a political scientist, but I've been teaching on Asian studies for the last 20 years. But over that time, I've been focusing on China and then discourses of racism. My background is in social theory and political science, so I've kind of moved into the extremist space. And that explains why I am not putting my live video up because I have been targeted by some of the extremists that we'll be talking about actually. So my motivation is to understand how new social movements and groups using the affordances of social media platforms form worldviews and explanatory frameworks which facilitate the entry into right-wing extremism. So, of course, I just got a bit of an issue with my slides. So, of course, as we all know, the 2020 pandemic and QAnon really basically super hyped this movement from normies, from groups into right-wing extremism. And I also draw attention to, perhaps not everybody's aware of this, but today there've been some amazing revelations by the ABC and also The Age on some Australian men that have been joining American neo-Nazi groups and extremist terrorist groups. So I encourage you all to have a look at that. And that's, again, another example of the sort of thing that we're talking about. Okay, so one of the things I think is really important is to look at how QAnon indigenizes itself and how it gets adopted in different places in different ways, and it speaks to local concerns. We can see, of course, QAnon's been around, for a couple of years, but I think the first time anybody really saw it at any kind of rally or demonstration was in the original lockdown rallies. So these are some photographs from the first lockdown rallies in Brisbane. We can see here that, there's a Q presence here. Australia stands with you, Victoria. This is from Brisbane when Victoria was in a strong lockdown. Thank you, saving our children. Here we have We Are One, Aussies, and the Q in the one. And also some pretty homemade efforts. So it was a bit amateur. We were kind of late to the Q merch bandwagon, I think, in Australia. But we can see that they were there right from the very beginning. And in fact, the anti-lockdown protests, anti-vaccination protests, anti-mask protests have given them an opportunity to come out, actually. In Victoria, there were also anti-lockdown rallies, and we can see here, typical kind of things if you're attuned to what the QAnon thing's about. This is a pandemic, global power grab, so on and so forth, Bill Gates, so on and so forth. So these are all the standard Q kind of talking points. But I draw your attention to this chap who is actually a prominent leader of the Proud Boys in Victoria. And this is an indication into what I've been looking at since the start of 2020, which was the fact that there were right-wing groups, far-right and extreme-right groups, well aware of the marketing opportunity and the recruiting opportunity that COVID provided. And they saw the QAnon normies as basically fresh meat. So we can see here the Proud Boys. By the end of the year, some of these rallies have become quite violent. This one was a particularly big one in Melbourne where the Proud Boys themselves all wore their colours. They had their F Antifa shirts on, and they got some pretty severe pepper spraying. This is the core Proud Boys leadership here in this photograph. And again, the Proud Boys themselves, they're autonomous in the different countries that they're in. So they operate as autonomous chapters. They don't follow hierarchical structure leading back to America. So in Canada, as people probably are aware, they've been prescribed as a terrorist group. I see no signs of them being a terrorist group in Australia, but they are a gang. They are concerning. They do have violence embedded into their structure, actually. And so here we see some of the indigenizing of the Proud Boy message. So the Proud Boys were there right from the beginning, but they weren't the only ones. And as we've seen, Pete Evans also posted this. He posted the Black Sun or the Sonnenrad, which was actually set in the floor of a castle by Himmler during the Nazi era. And people have noted that, as I think, Lydia and Vivian's excellent presentation noted, he's moved from that militant wellness into flirting around with this kind of more extremist material. But I also noticed well before he was even on Telegram or even on this path that neo-Nazis were talking about him and they recruited him. They picked him out. One of their wives had noted that Pete Evans might be open to being shifted along in his understanding. And so they started a dialogue with him, actually, via Twitter, I think it might have been, and then Instagram. And then they actually suggested to him that he move on to Telegram, and they helped him set up a Telegram channel. That is the channel that they currently co-admin. And so it was only very recently that Pete Smith, once he got completely deplatformed off Facebook and Instagram, they opened up a chat. And it's actually the function in Telegram. I'm sure not everybody's on Telegram, but the function of Telegram is it's a broadcast channel. You just put your stuff out, people can't comment. But if you open a chat, it's a free for all. And that's where you really see the kind of the shift to extremism going on. So those neo-Nazi, those neo-Nazis in this particular chat that I put the screenshot from, one of them is on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald today as one of the recruits to this international terrorist organisation. So he was chosen, he was groomed, and we see the results now. So I think that there's often there's some terminology that the QAnon world and the neo-Nazi world, conspirituality world all share, and in particular this notion of the red pill. It's not the same meaning across these different worlds. And I think there's a number of factors that are shared. So the first is, if everybody here has seen The Matrix, you know that Neo, the character here played by Keanu Reeves, has a choice. He takes the red pill, and from taking the red pill, he's on a heroic quest for the truth. And I think there's a couple of key words there. First, hero. Secondly, quest. Third, truth. And it's all through taking this so-called red pill. And what does the red pill actually mean? For both neo-Nazis and for QAnon followers, it's realizing that the world is not as it seems, that there's an evil global cabal in control, as Lydia and Vivian talked about. There's also a rejection of the mainstream media, and I've used the parenthesis here because neo-Nazis use that to indicate Jewish control. So you've already got a rejection of the mainstream media and the QAnons. All you need to do is convince people of the parentheses. Oh, but who's in control of me? Oh, it's the Jews. So straight away we have a shifting along that continuum towards neo-Nazi extremism. Suspicion about the government, the importance of individual action. And I think we've heard in earlier presentations, which were excellent this afternoon, about the power of emotions. This idea of resentment, we're resentful for what we've lost. We have a nostalgia for this longing for the past. There's fear, but there's also superiority. And I think a motivation is righteous anger. So those other sorts of emotions might debilitate someone, but righteous anger is a very motivating and action, future-focused kind of emotion. And I see these same kind of emotions going in the QAnon world and also the neo-Nazi world. For QAnon people, however, they've been trusting the plan, which was all around Donald Trump. He's got it under control. Some of them actually genuinely believe that he is still the president. For Nazis, that's not enough. And after post-January 6th, we see that more accelerationist neo-Nazi slogans appear in the QAnon world. There's no political solution. No one's coming to save you. And for Nazis, the most important thing is to get people onto the Jewish question. Now, part of my monitoring, I'm often up late at night, and I won't read this out to you, but basically this is someone saying, we need to get Christians to see that the base of our problems are the Jews. And this is how you do it. You just ask questions, you plant seeds. I can't actually see what's going on in the chat, but I imagine that I'm getting a wind up. Okay, so I think I'll just go through this very quickly. People often see Nazis around violence or around political ideology, but spirituality is really important to them. And so here there's a couple of symbols that they use. We can see they're using the runes that were used by the Nazis, and they're repurposing them. In this case, it's sort of a pagan satanic move, but they're also Christians. Now, brief warning, Brett and Tarrant, as we can see here, what the neo-Nazis have done with Brett and Tarrant is put him within a Christian framework and made him into a saint. And they're actually trying to meld these kind of images together of spirituality, Christianity, and their neo-Nazi hero, Saint Brendan. For neo-Nazis, they've been through this before, where they've seen normies, as they call it, from the MAGA movement, giving up hope on Trump and then moving into what they call clown world and accepting that things are violent and are falling apart. So this is just a trajectory of someone who went through that path, who started off as a lefty and now is an accelerationist neo-Nazi. And it's a move from giving up hope and a dismal giving up hope to taking joy, and power from violence, chaos, and accelerationism. So we have actually been here before through the Link Cafe siege, the demonizing of Muslims, the formation of Reclaim Australia, which was a populist movement that was infiltrated by Nazis right from the very beginning. They formed a couple of groups, the Lad Society, they inspired Brenton Tarrant, and now we've got Nazis burning crosses in the Grampians. So I guess my bottom line is that it's not just what's going on in the minds of the QAnon followers or the Conspirituality or the militant wellness people. There is active forces out there recruiting. And of course, the worry is that this is where we end up with accelerationist Nazism. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kaz, for that presentation. And it's just really interesting, and some of those pictures are really quite distressing too. And we appreciate your work in this space, and I'm really sorry to hear the way that it has left you a bit exposed. It really is a very challenging space in which to work. So I encourage people to, if you've got questions, and I know we've got a couple coming in, just pop them into the Q&A and we'll jump onto them at the end of this session. And I think we'll have a really productive discussion. Now, our final presenter for this session this afternoon will be Dr. Bernard Doherty, and he's currently course director in the School of Theology and a research fellow at St Mark's National Theological Centre in Canberra. So, and that's part of the Charles Sturt University. So, Bernard, thanks so much for joining us. If you've got some slides, feel free to pop them up now and start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, so my take on this is very different to what a lot of other people is I looked at particularly how one particular religious group has been affected by conspiracy theories and QAnon, and I can see a lot of overlap over the course of today. It's one of the benefits of being the last speaker. So I'm just going to sort of jump straight into it. Okay. Back in early 2017, an Australian journalist writing for the American-based Religion Dispatches wrote to me for a comment on links between Donald Trump's then chief strategist Steve Bannon and the Roman Catholic traditionalist subculture. I had previously assisted this journalist with background information on reactionary strands of Catholicism for work he had done on what was the now not so unique Catholic traditionalist enclaves which have appeared in Northern Idaho and Washington state. While I was then vaguely aware that that Bannon had roots in the traditionalist milieu, I was somewhat surprised by this journalist's revelations about the intensity of pro-Trump sentiment, which he had witnessed in sectors of what sociologist Michael Cuneo aptly labeled the netherworld of American Catholicism. And this diagram sort of shows in a diagrammatic way what I'm kind of talking about. It's quite a complex phenomena. Reflecting on this, though, I shouldn't have really been surprised. There's a historical connection between the Catholic right and the political right. This group of generally younger, though, more computer literate and more belligerent traditionalists supporting Trump have adopted the label of rad-trads, or radical traditionalists. Though in ideological terms, they're essentially representative of a generational shift within the wider traditionalist Catholic milieu, which has existed since the late 1960s and is essentially comprised of a network of different constituencies united by a partial or complete opposition to the modernising tendencies within the Roman Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council. Over the ensuing years, and there's a picture of a rad-trad. Over the ensuing years of Trump's presidency, the elective affinity between Roman Catholic traditionalism, the rad-trads, and pro-Trump politics has only grown, attracting some of the movement's most vocal online entrepreneurs, as well as a handful of dissident traditionalist bishops, like the German Walter Brandmüller, the Kazakhstani Athanasius Snyder, and the Archbishop Joseph Strickland from Tyler in Texas, and of course the sartorially splendid Cardinal Raymond Burke. All these bishops have been outspoken in their criticism of what they see as the liberal social agenda and theological errors of Pope Francis, and equally outspoken in their opposition to the Democrats in general and Joe Biden in particular. This elective affinity, however, also brought with it another trait shared by Trumpists and Catholic traditionalists more generally, and that is a shared propensity to conspiracy theories. Over the course of the Trump presidency, as Catholic online media outlets became increasingly militant in their partisan opposition to the Democrats, they also began to run a significant number of stories regarding conspiracist claims about diabolical child abuse. In particular, these conspiracist ideas began to appear with some frequency on conservative Catholic platforms like LifeSite News, Michael Voas's Church Militant, and even more mainstream conservative forums like the Catholic cable network EWTN, receiving extensive reach through their YouTube channels in particular. Indeed, one of the key figures in this milieu, and later one of the members of the advisory board for Donald Trump, Catholics for Trump, Taylor Marshall, has over the course of Trump's term become one of the most influential Catholic YouTubers. Okay, and there's him with a gun. Okay, while most of this material was careful not to explicitly cite Q and related earlier conspiracy theories like Pizzagate as their source, the thematic borrowings and shared language made the conspiracist connection very clear to anyone, arguably culminating in June 2020 when LifeSite News posted a letter written by the retired Italian Archbishop and vocal critic of Pope Francis, Carlo Maria Vigano, which he wrote to Donald Trump, in which he referred to an impending apocalyptic conflict between the children of light and the children of darkness, representing those whom Vigano called the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent, and suggesting that he and the president were on the same side in this battle. In this letter, Vigano alludes not only to Masonic conspiracies, globalism, and the New World Order, but also that just as there is a deep state, there is a deep church, which is, he writes, subservient to the deep state, to globalism, to aligned thought, to the New World Order, which they invoke ever more frequently in the name of a universal brotherhood, which has nothing Christian about it, but which evokes the Masonic ideals of those, said in context, who want to dominate the world by driving God out of the courts, out of the schools, out of the families, out of families, and perhaps even out of churches. Okay. In Q drop 4429, which is largely comprised of a quotation from Ephesians 6, chapter 6, verses 10 to 18, a favorite passage among spiritual warfare enthusiasts, Q linked Archbishop Vigano's letter, and within days, Trump also retweeted the same letter, encouraging everyone, religious or not, to read it. This letter, teeming with the language of conspiracies, was only the latest of a series of controversial statements by Vigano going back to 2018. But Trump's retweeting of the story from LifeSite News suddenly brought what had hitherto been largely an intra-Catholic feud into the foreground of American politics. The letter also became the centerpiece of the Catholics for Trump website campaign and set journalists off on a trail of who this Italian Archbishop, tacitly endorsed by Q, was and what he was alluding to. Meanwhile, on social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, the more covert or latent conspiracy themes found in Catholic media reporting were expanding into increasingly intricate meta-conspiracy narratives, which made it clear that that a significant number of Catholics were subscribing in part or whole to ideas purloined by QAnon, something later confirmed by a survey conducted by the conservative American Enterprise Institute, an organization with a long history of involvement in polling the Catholic right. And they found in February 2021 that as much as 18% of white Catholics believed in QAnon, 11% of Hispanic Catholics. They also found that 27% of white evangelicals believed in it, or parts of it. I skipped over a slide. So by the time of the November 2020 election, several major American news magazines had noticed this trend and the intensely conspiratorial turn of online conservative Catholic discourse. In the October issue of The Atlantic, for example, an article appeared from Tish Durkin entitled "The Catholics Who Hate Joe Biden and Pope Francis." While just over a week later, Vanity Fair published Catherine Joyce's piece, "Deep State, Deep Church: How QAnon and Trumpism Have Infected the Catholic Church," which sought to narrate what Joyce described in the byline as how Catholicism's increasingly powerful political right reflects fringe America, fueled by paranoia, conspiracy, racism, and the threat of apocalypse. The analyses presented by both Deakin and Joyce are both really good pieces of investigative journalism. I highly recommend reading them. However, by virtue of limited length, what neither could do, and what similar commentary in the secular media and in more progressive Catholic forums like the Jesuit American magazine have failed to do, is analyse just how deeply ingrained this type of conspiracist thinking has become in conservative Catholic circles, and some of the reasons for this. Indeed, it was not until the storming of the Capitol in January that American magazine, through its popular writer, Father James Martin, called out a series of conservative Catholic figures like Father James Altman and Bishop Joseph Strickland from Tyler for their hyper-partisan support of Trump and their use of apocalyptic and conspiracist rhetoric in pandering to conspiracy theorists. Conservative Catholics, closer to the sort of centre-right, however, had been resisting this trend for some years and had already seen the danger in what might be called the rise of the radtrads, something I'll come back to. Analyses on sort of centre-right conservative Catholic sites like Where Peter Is and the National Catholic Register had identified conspiracy theories as a key concern in the Catholic online sphere. And by July 2020, the generally centre-right Bishop of California, Robert Barron, whose Popular Word on Fire YouTube channel is one of the most popular YouTube channels amongst Catholics in the Anglophone sphere, became subject of hundreds of abusive comments after a clash with Taylor Marshall over issues relating to the Black Lives Matter movement, in particular, the destruction of statues of a particular American saint. After issuing what he called a pastoral cry from the heart to Catholics to refrain from online flame wars, Barron eventually called an invite-only meeting amongst members of the mainstream American Catholic press to discuss concerns about what he called a culture of contempt, which had emerged in much of the Catholic online discussion, in particular amongst the rad trads. Okay. So for the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to briefly introduce the distinctly Roman Catholic culture of conspiracy, and it overlaps with a lot of the stuff that's been spoken of today. Some of its constituent parts and its links with the wider traditionalist Catholic milieu. Secondly, I want to discuss what I see as three contributing factors which I think partially account for why conservative Catholics, and particularly radtrads, have been so ready to adopt QAnon-related conspiracy ideas, particularly those related to satanic child abuse. Okay, so one could spend days unraveling the tangled web of Catholic conspiracy culture, both in terms of conspiracy theories emerging from the Roman Catholic sources and conspiracy theories about Roman Catholicism. The Vatican, a decidedly pre-modern and Baroque institution, sits uncomfortably in the modern world, and its often secretive and old-fashioned modes of operation, coupled with residual but by no means abating anti-Catholic prejudices, is ripe for conspiracy theories. There's plenty of great films around with soutane-wearing cardinals lurking around up to evil and no good. To restrict myself to the last century, for instance, one could point to the vast number of conspiracy theories surrounding the death of Pope John Paul I in 1978, popularised in David Yallop's pulp paperback In God's Name, and in the subplot in the atrocious finale to the Godfather trilogy. Don't ever watch it. Or my personal favourite conspiracy theory in Catholic circles, largely because it's quite benign but kind of funny, is the, which comes also with photographic evidence, I should say, was that Pope John Paul II had been replaced by a doppelganger, and that this explained his slide into liberal heresy. And this one was popularised in the 1970s and early 80s by Veronica Lucan, the well-known seer of Bayside, who, in her various messages from the Virgin Mary, which I won't go into too much depth about, but there's a great book by Joseph Laycock about her, which I highly recommend. Okay. Moreover, one could also point to actual conspiracies involving the Roman Catholic Church, both benign and malevolent. The infiltration, just in Australia, the infiltration of the Labor Party in the 1950s is a great example. One need here only examine the cottage industry which has emerged over the contested history of Pius XII's behaviour during and following the Second World War to encounter examples of a clandestine institution working in the shadows. Complete here with soutane-wearing Jesuits, in the case played by Gregory Peck. For those who haven't seen The Scarlet and the Black, it's a great film. It's like the only film, though, in probably the last 30 years where the Catholic Church comes off looking all right. In general, however, there are what I would identify as 5 overlapping strands of Catholic conspiracism. There could be 6, but I'll leave the 6th one out because it will just lengthen things out. Each of which I'm going to briefly outline. So there's the anti-Masonic, the anti-Semitic, the anti-communist, the anti-Satanist, and the anti-modernist. And the 6th one is the Islamophobic, but that needs a whole paper in itself. So we'll start with anti-Masonry. Beginning in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the famous conspiracist tome of the Abbé Augustin de Barruel, Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism, Catholics have long suspected the Masons to be behind both the overthrow of throne and altar in France and the fermenting of revolution across 19th century Europe. While not entirely baseless, the links between European Freemasonry and anti-clericalism are very well documented. Most of the writings cited by these conspiracy theorists, for example, the so-called permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, cited by contemporary Catholic conspiracists like Taylor Marshall, are crude forgeries. Despite this, not a few popes have been taken in by the excesses of Catholic anti-Masonic law, most notably Pope Leo XIII, who was taken in by the infamous Taxil hoax during the 1890s. If you haven't heard of the Taxil hoax, Google this, it will make your day. Emerging from the same context, European context, in particular France during the Third Republic, is Catholic anti-Semitism, though it has much deeper historical roots. While the Roman Catholic attitude towards Jews has shifted considerably over recent decades, particularly after Nostra Aetate and the Second Vatican Council, it suffices to say that in Roman Catholic reactionary circles, the Jews have been viewed very negatively. They were, particularly from the time of Jewish emancipation, they've been blamed for the economic woes of Catholics, and and Catholics have been responsible for some of the most egregious anti-Semitic documents of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For instance, the Abbé Chabotay's 1882 screed, "The Jews, Our Masters," and of course the immoderate ravings of the American radio priest Father Charles Coughlin during the 1930s. And it continues into the present in traditionalist circles. The term radical traditionalist was popularized by the Southern Poverty Law Center with reference to traditionalists because of their anti-Semitic beliefs. Indeed, it was in French occultist and reactionary Catholic circles that the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion most readily circulated and found some of their most adamant supporters. Throughout the 20th century, moreover, the so-called Judeo-Masonic complot became the key plank of Catholic conspiracy culture and continues to have its advocates into the present. So, anti-communism. I should add too that all these categories overlap considerably, as you'll see. Catholic anti-communism, often linked in conspiracist Catholic minds with the Judeo-Masonic complot, has been another plank of Catholic conspiracy culture, particularly since the Cold War and the claims of ex-communist turned Roman Catholic Bella Dodd before the US House Un-American Activities Committee, where she appeared in 1953 and claimed that communists had infiltrated the Catholic priesthood. They probably had. The popularity of Catholic anti-communist conspiracies, moreover, ties in with Marian apparitions like that at Fatima in 1917 and a series of post-war European apparitions, largely unapproved by the church, it should be said, in which the Virgin Mary purportedly warned Christians, and Catholics in particular, about the threat of atheistic communism and the need to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. Groups like the late Father Nicholas Gruner's Fatima Crusaders, which was listed by the SLPC as a hate group, have perpetuated the deep-seated Catholic anti-communism of the Cold War era and intertwined it with other conspiracy theories, including anti-Masonic, anti-Semitic, and anti-modernist ideas, and anti-Satanic ideas. Okay. Catholic anti-Satanic conspiracy theories emerged out of both Catholic opposition and concern about the occult revival in France during the Third Republic, and from earlier tropes in anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic law. Both the Masons and the Jews have been seen at various times as fundamentally satanic. Catholic paranoia about the existence of so-called host stealing and infant sacrificing Satanists has persisted from the time of the Taxil hoax in the 1890s, which tied in with satanic Freemasonry and broadened everything. Basically, it was a satanic panic, but 100 years earlier. through the 20th century with writers like the clerical impersonator Montague Summers. Some of you may have read Montague Summers over the years. Basically, he wrote these very strange kind of books about the history of witchcraft, and he translated the Malleus Maleficarum into English, and he believed basically every conspiracy theory going around. But he was very influential. Right up until the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. And I'm going to come back to that. So we'll jump on to. Finally, and often linked up in various ways with the anti-Masonic, anti-Semitic, and anti-communist conspiracy theories are Catholic anti-modernist conspiracy ideas. Now, these are very much an internal Catholic thing. Here I use the term modernist not to indicate the loose-knit theological movement of the early 20th century suppressed by popes and Pius X, but rather the reaction amongst Catholic traditionalists to those who saw the modernist tendencies of theological experts of Vatican II as basically undermining the Second Vatican Council and turning it into this liberal heresy. So basically under the anti-modernist, depending on who's doing the speaking here, basically any important Catholic theologian of the 20th century, particularly those who are at Vatican II, gets included here. I've got pictures here of Karl Rahner, Henri de Lubac, Pilar Teilhard de Chardin, Hans Kung, Edward Schillebeeckx, and I could have put up dozens of others, incidentally all men. In its more extreme forms, it also includes every pope going back to John the 23rd, the pope who called the Second Vatican Council and has never been forgiven in traditionalist circles. In its more extreme forms, it also, so basically this conspiracy theory actually has theological foundations, and they have this whole theory tied up with Thomist theology about where Vatican II went wrong, and a reading of one particular history book about the council. I won't go into that. What's important though is it claims that theologians have been part of a malign influence in the background of the church, which has both human and demonic elites involved, and it's systematically undermined Catholicism since, reaching its apogee when Pope Francis became Pope in 2013. As I've suggested, each of these sort of 5 strands overlaps considerably, and in the rad-trad writers like Taylor Marshall, one finds aspects of almost all of these. So here's a quote from Taylor Marshall. Minus overt anti-Semitism, which tends to be more muted, at least publicly. So a lot of these figures in the rad-trad sphere will use very coded language publicly, and in private be far more openly anti-Semitic. However, this pre-existing propensity for conspiracies amongst rad-trads provided a perfect entree into wider online meta-conspiracies like QAnon. In this area, I'd like to suggest 3 factors need to be considered. The first is a heightened interest, particularly amongst conservative American Catholics, in demonology, which has grown steadily since the 1960s, arguably in response to what they see as an increasingly permissive society and a desanctified church. And a lot of people who kind of imbibe their Catholicism watching The Exorcist, it has to be said. While time does not permit me to discuss the matrix of conspiracy theories surrounding the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s, which has been mentioned a lot today, it is worth remembering that the book which arguably more responsible for feeding this than any other was Michelle Remembers, written by 2 Roman Catholics, which initially contained a preface from the Roman Catholic Bishop of Victoria in Canada, Remy Deroux, and was extremely popular in Catholic circles. I found a copy of this book actually at a bookstore at the dump, and I think that suggests a lot about its quality. Similarly, in terms of books popular amongst conservative Catholic publishers, are not a few on the theme of spiritual warfare and demonology, both topics which are incidentally to be found normally on the popular books section at Catholic bookshops, including the one at the Cathedral here in Canberra. Perhaps most notable here are the works of the late defrocked priest Malachi Martin, who wrote numerous conspiracy-laden works of fiction and purported non-fiction. He wrote a history of Vatican II and a history of Vatican-Soviet diplomatic relations over decades. And basically, he managed to bring together the entire panoply of Catholic conspiracy cultures. Indeed, in 1996, he wrote a paperback potboiler called Windswept House, which is all about the machinations of a child-abusing satanic bishop. We're starting to detect a theme here. Put simply, Catholics have a deep and inviting interest, an unhealthy interest in some circles, in the satanic and conspiracies about it. Okay, the second factor is that in Catholicism, there was already a pre-existing online subculture of what is referred to sometimes as Catholic apocalyptic or Marian apocalyptic, which has existed on the fringes of American and even Australian Catholicism for decades, and has been a primary seedbed for the various anti-Masonic, anti-communist, and anti-satanic conspiracy ideas. This essentially revolves around apocalyptic messages revealed by the Virgin Mary to various seers, claiming that if you do not repent, I'm going to destroy Sydney, or a flood's going to destroy Perth. And as one Australian seer told us in the 1980s, he was not correct. What is important here is that this subculture, which comprises a network of self-styled visionaries sharing purported messages from heaven or private revelations, was one of the most adroit early adopters of online dissemination techniques, long before the days of contemporary social media and its network structure. And this was a huge network in the 90s and in the early days of sort of the internet. The vast online presence of what anthropologist Peter J. Margry calls the global network of divergent Marian devotion has in place an already highly conspiracist network attuned and geared towards the dissemination of apocalyptic and ultra material. So my preliminary analysis of some of these forums and informal discussions with people who are very enthusiastic, we'll say, about this kind of stuff, is that they've been a major base for the spread of QAnon ideas into conservative Catholic circles. Though it's also worth noting that this is a highly competitive and acrimonious milieu, and there's by no means a uniform position on the truth of QAnon. So not everyone in this network necessarily believes in it. The final factor as to why Catholics have been susceptible to QAnon claims in particular is the reality of clerical malfeasance and actual conspiracies and cover-ups of child sexual abuse within the Roman Catholic Church. Since the late 1980s, stories of historical and contemporary clerical abuse have become ubiquitous, perhaps the most immediate image of Catholicism which springs to minds of non-Catholics. That they would be linked up with satanic panic themes, particularly in Roman Catholic quarters, as a form of displacement of responsibility is hardly surprising. Indeed, the sociologist and priest Father Andrew Greeley penned a best-selling pulp novel in 1993 entitled Fall from Grace on precisely this theme. It has a cabal of satanic elite pedophile Catholic priests abusing children. Similarly, alleged revelations about the operation of various homosexual cliques within the Vatican, which had become a cause célèbre in 2018 with the publication of Frederick Martel's In the Closet of the Vatican, Power, Homosexuality, Hypocrisy, provided a rhetorical foil to conservatives for formulating new conspiracy narratives about what they diagnose as a link between more permissive culture following the sexual revolution and the liberal theology of the post-Vatican II era and the scourge of child sexual abuse. So an example of a more recent book in this regard is Phil Lawler's The Smoke of Satan, How Corrupt and Cowardly Bishops Betrayed Christ, His Church and the Faithful, and What Can Be Done About It. Indeed, the recent revelations surrounding the now defrocked and laicized Cardinal Theodore McCarrick have become a major plank in the arguments presented by figures like Taylor Marshall, whose book Infiltration draws this together with Vatican liberal cliques, anti-Masonic law, suggestions of dark involvement of occult groups associated with Aleister Crowley. No conspiracy theory is complete unless you can work in Aleister Crowley, and Pope Francis is somehow at the behest of these people. Okay. So just to conclude, none of these three factors on its own explains the popularity of QAnon amongst traditionalist Catholics, or indeed amongst various other religious groups. What they do show is that such ideas often find a fertile seedbed within pre-existing religious subcultures. And I think it's important that we research some of these subcultures. In the ongoing discussion of conspirituality, particularly in the broad sense which David Voas spoke of last night, it is important that reservoirs for this kind of conspiracy thinking and indeed of conspiracist ideas within mainstream religions also be looked at. Thank you.
Bernard, thanks so much. And thank you to Lydia and Vivian and also Kaz for some really excellent and interesting points. So we'll now turn to questions. Firstly, we've got a couple for Bernard, but also I might sort of I might start with a question to Kaz and also to Vivian and Lydia. I mean, both of you, or all of you kind of sort of talked about some of the antecedents of the QAnon conspiracy theory, and particularly like the relationship to sort of anti-Semitism and protocols of elders of Zion. I guess my question is, to what extent did the creators, almost sit there with those older books and just kind of copy that in? Was it willful or deliberate, or that's this kind of source? I'm thinking about the Watkins or whoever is responsible for QAnon. I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I have a kind of cynical conspiracy theory of my own as it is about this, is that I actually think it's someone who's read a lot about the history of conspiracy theories, and then initially QAnon was probably something of a practical joke, and seeing how far they could kind of push things. Because I mean, everything in it, I think, and I referred to the Taxil hoax a couple of times in my paper, because I've been waiting kind of for someone to drop and say, basically, I'm the Leo Taxil of QAnon. I made this up, and look at the bullshit I've made you all believe. And so that's my kind of cynical take on it. It's not serious, but yeah.
I guess my view on it would be follow the clicks.
Yeah.
Basically, I mean, this stuff is being thrown up on the Chans, 4chan, 8chan all the time. There's always deep throats coming out saying, we know this, we know that. But looking at, I think Lydia and Vivian's paper really put their finger right on it. This is a political conspiracy. The antecedent is the whole Pizzagate, children in the Comet Pizza at, Washington, D.C. Hillary Clinton's going to be arrested. So it's all to serve Trump's aim of, discrediting Hillary Clinton. And of course, he's used heaps of conspiracies before, the whole Obama birther thing, that Obama's not American, all that kind of stuff. So this is, in my view, it comes out of the weaponizing of the internet through Gamergate and the alt-right. That's really, all these elements are there. It's like you go to the buffet, you assemble your plate of food, and unfortunately, you go where the clicks are. So do I think, say, someone like Pete Evans is a neo-Nazi? Nope. I seriously think he has no idea what even a neo-Nazi is. But I do think that he just goes where the clicks are. And unfortunately, there are forces pulling them to the anti-Semitic end of that sort of click buffet.
Thanks. The other panel, Lydia and Vivian, if you had any thoughts about that, otherwise I'm happy to move on to the next question.
Well, I'd just say quickly, I'd broadly agree with Kaz on this, but also to say that because there's so much unknowns about the origins of Q at this stage, it's really a difficult question to answer. How much exactly have they engaged with all of this source material and history? But, like Kaz described, it's a buffet of information that's already out there. If you take a look at some of the people within the wellness community that Vivian and I have, I would highly doubt that they actually have engaged with all of this stuff. This is something that's kind of filtered down through them. But in terms of the originators of this, it's a big unknown.
Is it as unknown? Like there's been some, the QAnon podcast by Jake Hanrahan and the new HBO documentary that's coming out. It seems like, maybe I'm wrong, but kind of quite a good sense of who and what's responsible for it.
Yeah, but I think there's no definitive answers yet. And even though if we do know individuals who might possibly be behind it, at this stage, we still don't know exactly how much they've engaged with the source material of some of these older conspiracies.
Yeah, of course. Panel, we've got a question to all of you from Christina. Can you please discuss the role of trust in the spread of conspiracy theories? And she's particularly interested in social media used by families and small groups, such as WhatsApp and Telegram.
Vivian might be good to answer this one.
I've never heard of Telegram. My kids communicate
just on the role
with
of
me
trust.
WhatsApp.
You've done some stuff
Trust,
with this.
Yeah, I think if there's a closed group of friends or family members and information or disinformation or misinformation, because they are different things. So misinformation is information that people think is is factual but isn't. Disinformation is actively misinforming people for political reasons. So if you're in a closed group online and you get a piece of information from people that you do trust, you're more likely to believe it. And it's going to have much more purchase on you than other sources of information. So even though you might read the newspaper or you might watch the news on television, not to say that those are necessarily reliable sources of information either, but having that close proximity through social media and through closed groups, I think does enable disinformation to travel much faster than it has at other times. And the role of trust in that is clear, that these are trusted sources of information because of that relationship, pre-existing relationship. I've seen this play out in WhatsApp groups in Italy with friends, like naturopath friends, for example, who early on in the pandemic were having conversations with me about some of the things they were seeing. And since that time, those people are now, I think, quite down the road of particular kinds of conspiritual thinking, not necessarily militant, but definitely immersed in that milieu and largely through these sorts of channels. So I think it's a really critical point and something that is being looked at but needs more attention.
I think, Andrew, it's important to understand how Telegram differs from something like Facebook, because Telegram is not guided by algorithms. You actually have to go and find the stuff yourself. There is no algorithm. The more you look at something, the more something's suggested. Nothing is suggested. You have to, muddle your way through. And you find that the QAnon community, when they were booted off Facebook, which sort of arranges everything very clearly, you can see what's going on, you can form groups, you can work out who's who. In Telegram, everything's really anonymous. And also the QAnon community, when they move there, they'd be in groups who say 20,000 people in one chat. So you just imagine that if you don't look at it for one day, there's 3,000 or 4,000 posts. So, it is absolutely overwhelming. So you can't tell if someone is trying to blackpill them and turn them into neo-Nazis because it's just, left behind in the wash. But also on Telegram, you can form secret, private, small groups. And I think that the anonymity of Telegram and the hugeness of Telegram means that the trust in those smaller groups is even more important, actually. So on the one hand, you think that trust wouldn't work the same way on Telegram because it's too huge. But on the other hand, it forces them into more intimate settings than they would have in Facebook. That's my observation.
Thanks.
Can I add too, just on
Sure.
this, very quickly on the point of trust? I think that it impacts things in a number of ways. And earlier in the presentation, we discussed how QAnon is coming out of this broader disinformation ecosystem and this infodemic that we're all living in. And so it's kind of resulted in this environment where even if you are not a believer in conspiracy theories, the massive amounts of disinformation and misinformation basically has this effect of muddying the waters to the point where it's extremely difficult to understand what is real and what is not, what is fact and fiction, what is true, or authoritative or not. So even if you don't believe in a particular conspiracy theory or you think QAnon is crazy, it has that broader effect on society and erodes trust further. At the same time, it's a result of an existing erosion of trust of our institutions, right? So something like this wouldn't have had such an uptick if there wasn't such massive amounts of distrust with government institutions, arising from a variety of things, legitimate corruption, the negative effects of capitalism, all of these things that we've kind of been discussing. And then, I would also point to a really great article written by J.M. Berger, who's an extremism studies researcher, who talks about how in this disinformation environment, our consensus reality has broken. And past panelists had referred to the fact that, people within particular communities look to each other to understand what is true and what is real. And in this broader disinformation environment where the erosion of established fact is present, it's led to this rupture in consensus reality, and therefore you're more likely to be looking toward people who you will trust to confirm your reality.
Thanks, everyone. Bernard, I've got a question from Neville. I just want to preface it by saying I've done a lot of research on Catholic teenagers for more than a decade, and recently done some research with Anna about Catholic teenagers. And for the most part, Catholic teenagers don't go to, mass, but the ones who do tend to be a bit more socially conservative. So the question that, that's just my observation, and you'd be well in touch with this, but is it possible to comment on the spread of rad trad in Australian dioceses? And I love that rad trad thing.
It's tricky. The first thing with rad trads is that they're more likely to exist in traditionalist enclaves.
Yeah.
So in particular, you will find them very readily in Society of St. Pius X churches. So these are churches that are canonically irregular, is the sort of term that's sometimes bandied about, is that they're kind of half in, half out with the Catholic Church. They're Latin Mass, 1956 Latin Mass. They don't, they recognize the Pope formally, but basically they think everything that the Vatican II was wrong. So that's where you will find sort of young rad trads rather than in normal diocesan structures, at least not publicly. You will find them in kind of Latin Mass parishes. There's a few in Melbourne where they'd kind of haunt about. I won't name them. One's in Sydney and sort of Brisbane and places like that, but they tend to be very much on the fringes. It's kind of a sectarian subset within Catholicism, and it's got very fluid boundaries, I think. So, and the rad trad term is very much online. I think in the meme, one of the memes I showed sort of made a real point that you learn more theology from YouTube than you would at the seminary and this kind of thing. So it's very much an online subculture rather than in person per se. But you do, I think your point about socially conservative young Catholics holds true. And one of the other things is that they're returning to traditional liturgy, and that becomes an entry point. Like, it's like, I love the sanctity of the Latin Mass, that's what I say. And then they start to, the problem is that once you go to a Latin Mass community, you scratch the surface, and in tea and coffee after, you'll hear hollow hoax kind of things. You'll hear anti-Semitism from the older members and this kind of stuff. It's really entrenched in that subculture in particular.
And just to sort of piggyback on the back of that video had asked earlier, to what extent has this kind of taken hold, rad trad, in Catholic communities in the global South? And you talked about a global context, but could you sort of get a bit forensic on locations if you can?
I'm only really familiar with the rad trad subculture in the Anglosphere.
Yep.
I'm not very good with languages. I do know there is a big movement, traditionalist movement in Latin America, traditionally, particularly in Brazil. One of the sort of founding bishops of kind of the modern traditionalist movement was Antonio de Castro Mayer, who was a bishop in Brazil, and was part of the whole Lefebvre consecrations. I'm not going to go into that. So there's historically a lot of sort of connection, but the rad trad thing is very American and Australian. It's got this Anglo kind of, more of an Anglo kind of thing. It's like sedevacantism, which is this related trend. It's very much, it's very popular in America. But yeah, but there's certainly, and with the Marian apparition stuff, that side of it is far more global. I mean, that's huge in Africa, Latin America, even the Philippines and this kind of thing. So that's where it sort of spreads out a lot more.
Thank you. Emily, I just noticed in there that you wanted to contribute something to that discussion.
No, sorry, I was just moving it to the answered section.
Okay. Never trust technology or animals, but I think we're getting there. Now I have a question for initially for Lydia and Vivian, but of course panel members also interested in your answers. So how does evangelical Christianity, whose followers participate in these conspiracy theories, particularly QAnon, how do they sit with anti-Semitism, given that there's a large portion of them who have been adopting Jewish practices and support the estate of Israel, a phenomenon called Judaization? That's a question for Christina. Great question. Thanks, Christina.
Vivian, do you want to take this, or are you happy for me to address it? Or
You go.
I think that's a great question too, and I think yeah, it's a few strands to pull, because I think the evangelical Christian movement, particularly in the Western context and in the United States, in particular, is quite literally a broad church. So you have a number within the evangelical community who espouse anti-Semitic beliefs, others who are extremely pro-Israel, but even those who are pro-Israel instrumentalize that relationship. So they see it as part of, essential to kind of the theology of the second coming, which they believe that Jews returning to a homeland will, predate the return of Christ. And the other intersection with QAnon is that because it is a far-right conspiracy theory, it's a political conspiracy theory, it's a pro-Trump conspiracy theory, you have a number of evangelical Christians who are also majority Republican Trump supporters. So I think that there are different strands within the evangelical Christian community in the United States. And then you can also be anti-Semitic and pro-Israel within that community. So it gets quite a bit complicated, or be one or the other.
I'd just like to add in there that I've never seen so many discussions of religion, Christianity, the Bible. Was Hitler a Christian? Is the Bible Jewish? Who are the chosen people? As I see in alt-right, far-right and extreme right groups, they never shut up about religion. They talk about it all the time. So I never see that in left groups. So I think that, religion and this kind of working out this knotty problem around anti-Semitism is a really live issue in the groups that I look at.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, one of the kind of hate that is around Christianity and some of the ways in which you've talked about it sort of tilting to the right reminds me a bit of sort of the early 70s when Hal Lindsey published this book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which was kind of about the impending apocalypse. And it was a very violent kind of book that made the New York Times bestseller list. And that was kind of a response to sort of social upheaval of the late 1960s. And it, again, from my kind of limited reading, I see sort of some parallels there between sort of social anxiety and some social chaos and a kind of angry militant religious response that comes around that. People, do we have any further questions?
I'll just make a quick comment just very quickly about this discussion of religion that Kaz alluded to. I mean, one of the things that's been concerning to me, particularly as an individual who's come out of the Orthodox Christian community as my background, is I'm starting to see this discussion around Orthodox Christianity, particularly Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as an alternative to, either Catholicism or Protestantism, sorry, in the West. And, you see these discussions that have been very surprising to me about like, oh, we need to start an Australian Orthodox church, among members of the far right. So this turn to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, I think, is quite interesting too.
Thanks. Thank you.
I just had a point, Andrew, on the evangelical stuff.
Yep.
And if you look at it, like the QAnon thing is just, to me, I mean, I'm not a scholar of religion, but it fits into that evangelical framework, which is there's a plan. You don't know what the plan is, but someone does know what the plan is. Trust them. They've got the plan. The baddies will get their comeuppance. The goodies will be rewarded. It's all going on some other realm where the demons at the side, the side of the angels are fighting it out. And so in a sense, there's comfort in that, because the idea that no one's in control, that the planet is burning, is just so terrifying. So I see it also, the other evangelical aspect is the importance of waking people up. And that's something that the far right, the Nazis see as well. They want to convert people. They think it's their duty to convert people. And so do the QAnons. So in that way, when journalists ask me, well, do you think they're pests? I say, well, I don't like evangelicals knocking on my door on a Saturday morning and waking me up to try to wake me up. But I see that they're doing it from a good intention, actually. They're from a part of, we think that you're going to burn, we want to save you. And I think that that's a big overlap with a kind of an altruistic motivation with the neo-Nazis as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. In fact, another parallel between sort of evangelical Christianity and QAnon is this kind of anxiety about children's welfare. And the satanic panic driven in the 1980s was very much about an anxiety about children, and that was coming out of evangelical circles. And there's that interesting parallel now in vulnerable times. The most vulnerable people are construed as children. So that's an interesting theme.